In the Old Testament, Job laments, "For the thing which I greatly feared has come upon me, and that which I was afraid of is come unto me." That's the way many people of faith feel about the surprise results in our presidential election. For some reaction and some words of hope, let's welcome Reverend Jorge Morales, Conference Minister of the Illinois Conference of the United Church of Christ. We also welcome Tabassum Haleem, Executive Director of the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago. And we welcome Dr. Myron McCoy, Senior Pastor at the First United Methodist Church, Chicago Temple. Could you all describe what some of the reaction was, not only from you, but from your community as well?
Well, I can tell you that the reaction that I have noticed has been quite diverse. There are a lot of people of faith who immediately jump to pronouncing hope and expectation. And then there are those who have felt great disappointment, a feeling of devastation, insecurity, great deal of fear. Particularly in our Latino community, a great deal of fear about what is going to happen to families that have been able to stay here, not get deported, those who have benefited from the DREAM Act, children greatly fearful, will my parents be deported? The reaction of children in elementary schools, crying over their classmates and wondering, will you get deported? What will happen to you? Or bullying and saying, don't talk to me because you are going to be deported now.
I would say shock was probably the most prevalent sentiment. Just shock as to how someone so qualified as Hillary Clinton was, and who showed in word and deed how dedicated she was to public service, who had a track record, spoke about inclusion, and had a plan that she had worked on for many, many years, about how to provide for children's rights, women's rights, job opportunities, and foreign relations, how to work with foreign leaders, and how to work towards peace. How does all of that get set aside in place of someone who appeals to emotions or fear or hate? So there's that shock, but there's also being from a faith community. Of course, there's the trust in God, and knowing that somewhere in this decision, somewhere in this outcome, that there is opportunity for people to work together and find courage to do the right thing.
I guess I'm like the others, a lot of fear, a lot of shock, certainly concerns in the community regarding immigrants, regarding LGBTQ community, even folk who had an interest in the environment. Where are we going? What's going to happen with our standing in the world? How will we relate to other people? A lot of mourning, public mourning. We have early morning communion on Wednesday, and so there was, meeting the people immediately, and on Wednesday noon service, a tone, and certainly on Wednesday and even today, larger attendances than normal as people are trying to make sense out of what has gone down. And I think the surprise and even the stun shock is both true for both those who won as well as those who lost. I don't think the ones who won expected to win.
I don't think anybody expected it.
Yeah.
And it's been a big shock for a lot of people. And you're right, on both sides of this. Well, you've said it already that there are many people who are coming in who you might not have seen their face before, but they're coming to churches, they're coming to synagogues and mosques, they're coming and now looking for answers, looking to help make meaning out of this moment in history. What are you saying to them?
Well, certainly we're reminding people of our faith that this is not the first time in life that we've had disappointments, and that God is still God in the midst of that. We're reminding people that it's not a time to fold up their tents, but it is a time to remain vigilant and working and advocating for those things that we believe in and we think are right, and being advocates for people who feel most fearful.
Is there more to be said in you all's communities that Myron hasn't said in terms of how do we talk to people when they're coming inside of our congregations and communities and are just lost, they're angry, they're afraid, and afraid for good reason? Donald Trump ran on promises of what would happen to the Latino and Muslim communities. So how do you all respond to this?
Well, one of the things that I point to is a new generation of young people and millennials and the hope and promise that they offered. In spite of the fact that they may feel disenfranchised and somewhat defeated over the loss of the fact that Bernie Sanders was not the candidate, I think they offer the greatest hope. And now, as people turn to protest, many at the front lines of those protests are those young people, that new generation, saying we are dissatisfied and we will continue to work toward change. One of the commentators today, in fact, I think it was Gingrich, who said that Donald Trump is going to bring about change and make America great for a new generation. But the question is that new generation are those millennials, and they are not where Donald Trump is. They are not seeking what those who elected Donald Trump are seeking.
That's a very good point. It's very ironic that the millennials are the ones that are probably the most tolerant, inclusive. They have grown up in an environment that does promote inclusiveness in our society. They notice this in schools. They notice this in families, on sports teams. When these kids, young adults, they like to, work together. So it's very ironic that this old guard would think that this exclusiveness is what would appeal to the young, to the youth. They may be out of touch.
It seems to have worked, though, in terms of an election, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, these millions of people that have voted based on extremism, based on lack of empathy in communities. We don't need to know how you feel or what you're going through or what your life is like. I'm here to tell you how we're going to make it better. Mm-hmm. And so how do we generate discussion and conversation that includes empathy, or is it time for that? Should we be harnessing this anger and just giving people space to be afraid and upset right now? I'm just curious because it's happening so much right now.
Well, one of the things that I encourage people to do is to debrief, to gather in places where they can have open conversation, to even engage those who may have voted differently. Particularly in the church, we're challenged by it because, as I said to some 150 members of the United Church of Christ yesterday in a meeting, there's no doubt that Donald Trump got elected by a good number of our own church members. But unfortunately, many of those people who voted for Donald want to live in the past. The greatness that they're looking for in the past, the world that they're hoping for, is gone. We need to move forward. We need to create a new, beloved community of the people that are part of our society. in spite of how unhappy they may be, that our cities are becoming and our country is becoming more internationalized, that is our reality. Not only in terms of culture, but even in terms of our faith. We are a people of faith, and our faiths include many faiths.
I think it's also important to find out exactly what people are afraid of. If we, for those people that, first of all, the economic reality of losing your job and not knowing when you'll find another one, a lot of manufacturing jobs disappearing, not knowing. Most of them will probably not come back because of technology. So that the realization that it is a changing world, and people need to change with it in terms of acquiring new skills, finding new ways of putting their talents forth, and being able to support their families. But that is a legitimate concern of obviously a majority of people that voted for Trump. And we can't dismiss that. And what's ironic is that when people of faith, or the people who voted for Hillary Clinton, I believe that they were also, by and large, that's what they were working towards, is income equality, is correcting that disparity between the highest earning and the lowest earning. They were working towards that. So why a certain class of people or certain segments of the population felt that she wasn't speaking to them, when she was talking about creating meaningful jobs at meaningful wages and giving people the opportunity to take care of their families and send their kids to school, why they thought that she wasn't speaking to them. That's something we need to figure out.
Mm-hmm. There's another aspect to it. I think certainly Mr. Trump knew what to say to get elected and how to be a crier and a barker to certain elements.
You think he meant it?
Within the public. It's hard to know. And I think the reality of governing versus what one's rhetoric is can be different. And, we have a government that's not just one person. It's not one agency within the government. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to be engaged in all facets of our civic life together, because one person's views do not control where we go as a country.
Did you want to
But what I worry about, yes, one person's view, but as we spoke about before, where the concern lies, I think, for a lot of us, is how it impacts policy decisions.
Absolutely.
And who is put in place to articulate those policies. Does that really represent all of us, and American values? So that's, really the concern. And we hope that he surrounds himself, that President-elect Donald Trump surrounds himself with individuals that are wise, that are, that take the long-term view and put policies in place that are sustainable and not just.
Yeah. And what I'm saying is he's already taken a backup from what he said in terms of repealing the Affordable Care Act. And I think he's going to have to take a look at everything
Absolutely.
that he said.
Well, it's one thing to get elected and to do whatever and say whatever to get elected. We've seen this throughout history. It's another to govern people, and to govern people who don't even agree with you, who are out protesting and saying, not my president, but to still feel a responsibility to them and to make those communities real.
And the fact remains, he won the electoral vote, electoral college vote, but in terms of the majority vote in the country, most persons did not vote his position. And so there is a mix. And I think in order to govern, he's going to have to recognize that he does not have a consensus.
And maybe doesn't need one to do the things that he wants to do. But we've got to do better at working together. Let me just name the elephant in the room here, right? Like, white supremacy got Donald Trump elected. These are policies of white supremacists across this country who feel like, we know this is not an old system. This is not old racism. This is bigotry and ideas that, whether they actually happen or not, or whether he walks back on some of these ideas, the fact is he used them to get elected and made promises about rights that would be removed from folks. And one question that we're all asking in our various contexts is, how can faith remain relevant? How can it remain at the table in these important conversations around white supremacy, around rights, around policies that need to change? So what does our faith have to say in response to white supremacy, to hatred that is fueling people right now in the streets?
Well, I think that's a fundamental and vital question. Because we people of faith, I think if we're honest and faithful, our elected president really challenged and stood against many of the values that we believe in. And so it is a challenge for us now to stand firm for those values of inclusion and diversity, of honoring every human being, of creating a world that is more just and peaceful for everyone, and to proclaim a message of unity and inclusion versus exclusion. And I think our elected president has an enormous challenge, because even those who brought him into the presidency will be watching to see to what extent he will honor his commitment to the lower class, the poor, whites, versus Donald's clear commitment, which he made to the 1%, the business world, the power world. If he will uplift the poor, or will he basically provide more benefits to the rich and the powerful?
Yeah. But Jorge, one of the things we have to recognize, certainly he made an appeal to white supremacists, but the reality is that he convinced a lot of educated, suburban folks.
Yes.
He convinced a lot of people in small towns who may not be racist as we would consider them, and that there were other issues on the table, such as what the FBI head did, to mix and mingle into things. So I don't think everybody who voted for him believes everything that he voiced in terms of his positions.
Mm-hmm. I think you're completely right. I mean, the more recent counting, for instance, states that a majority of women voted for Donald Trump. And I think one of the challenges for us in the faith community is to create a new consciousness.
Yes.
What's the meaning of that? If women were assaulted, why were they not in solidarity with African American, third world people in this country? Why were they not in solidarity with Latinos and immigrants and others? And that's a challenge.
So how do we do that? Tabassum, how do we do that inside of communities?
Well, so let me just step back and address the idea of race, or singular race having supremacy. In Islam, we take comfort in the Quranic verse chapter 49, verse 13, that says, "O mankind, we have created you from a single pair of male and female, and created you into nations and tribes, so that you may come together and get to know each other, not so you despise each other. And the noblest of you are those that are best in deeds." And there's another verse that says, "If we had wanted to, we could have created you into one people with one language." So we singularly reject this idea of one race in Islam. We firmly believe, and God tells us in the Quran, that diversity is how He planned us to be a diverse population. So, and even historically in the U.S., none of the major accomplishments that the country as a whole has made, or challenges that it has overcome, was done without the white majority. Abolition movement, the civil rights movement, the protests against the Vietnam War, all of that, it needed white participation. So we take comfort in that the voices that call for bigotry and hatred against people of color is a minority. Yes. We have to believe in that, and we see that through U.S.
And we have to do something about it. The last question is linked directly to Martin Luther King Jr.'s final book title, "Where Do We Go From Here?" What happens now in the midst of all these feelings, all of these real fears and everything going on? What's the next thing that needs to happen from your community's perspective?
We need to find a way to cross the boundaries that we have established in this nation. And in fact, when I talk about the suburbs, we've been carved into districts so that we do not deal with people who think differently than we do. And so it's important for us to find ways in which we get people who are not of the same mind to be in conversation with one another. That's how we're going to break down some of this.
We have to address the fear. I think there's an enormous fear, and I think much of that fear results from the fact that we live in our own bubbles. Yeah. And there are people who, for reasons that are ununderstandable to some of us, I think we encounter the holy in the other, who is different than we. But when we choose to live segregated and in our own bubbles and refuse to encounter the other, we miss out on a great deal of what the meaning of life is.
We're already, we're continuing to do what we have been doing for a while, which is to work in coalitions, partnerships with other faith communities, community organizing group. In fact, we have an assembly next Thursday of churches, mosques, synagogues, and other organizations where we're working on mental health issues together, building mental health crisis centers, dealing with refugee crisis, and other boots on the ground issues that affect all of us, regardless of our faith. So we just, hunker down and keep doing what our faith calls us to do. And that's how we combat fear, and know that ultimately we all believe in the God that's loving and just.
Well, what you all are doing is so important right now, and there are so many communities that are depending on your perspective and your strategy and your next steps so that the world can move from a broken place into a more beautiful place. And there's beauty around, and I know it because of the work that you all are doing. Jorge, Tabassum, Myron, thank you all so much for what you do, and you have my thoughts and prayers, as well as many people who are looking to hear from you and see you real soon. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
I'm Julian DeShazier for Different Drummers in the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries. Keep the faith.